Alrighty, awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. We are officially live. Welcome to Grad Chat by PhD Balance. We talk about topics of grad school beyond just academic research and topics that might be more difficult to talk about day to day. Today is definitely going to be one of those days. So I'm pleased to be your host today. I'm Niba. I am a multimedia science communicator. I'm basically a science content creator. I am also the PhD Balance Ideals team leader. Ideals is our inclusivity, diversity, equity, accessibility, leadership team here at PhD Balance. Before going any further, I would like to pay respect and acknowledge that I am on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land and in accordance with their traditions, they have never seceded, lost, or forgotten their responsibilities as the caretaker of this place, and I recognize that I benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. So if you like what you see here today on Grad Chat, please check out the PhD Balance YouTube channel for more of our grad chats, and don't forget to subscribe for notifications for when we go live. So like I mentioned, our topic today is a little bit on the topics that are difficult to talk about in academia side. We're going to be talking about advisor conflict and LGBTQ plus mentorship. So I'm really excited to welcome our guest, Abby Nissenbaum. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Absolutely. So Abby is an MBA candidate and a data analyst in Nashville, Tennessee. She refused to falsify data as requested by her advisor and received a lot of retaliation and was asked to leave her PhD in social psychology. Secondly, Abby is also a talented musician and singer, currently working on a forthcoming EP. It's going to be centered around themes of harassment and abuse in academia, as well as mental health consequences. So Abby, we are so pleased to have you today on Grad Chat to discuss your experiences.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about the situation with your advisor, what the lead up was like, and kind of how you found yourself in this place?
Yeah, for sure. So during my first year of grad school, I was asked to work on a forthcoming manuscript with my advisor with an experiment that he had already conducted and had data for. So prior to me going into the PhD program. So I was basically just going to write up the manuscript for him and act as a second author. And this manuscript was centered around biphobic and homophobic harassment in the workplace. And as a lesbian incoming student, my advisor, I guess, thought it would be good to have me be on the paper, not only as someone who is interested in those types of topics, but as someone who is part of the LGBTQ community. So the following summer, after I had started working on that project in my first year of my PhD, I attended the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Sciences annual conference. And there I learned about a topic called p-hacking. And prior to attending that conference, as I was writing up this manuscript and analyzing data with my advisor, I realized that something that we did, a big part of how we obtained the results that we had obtained, used one of these statistical things that you do that would fall under p-hacking. Yeah, so p-hacking is sort of like any constellation of statistical techniques that inflates your p-value, so inflates your significance value while creating a misleading result. So in this case, we had participants we asked participants basically about their experiences with heterosexist, so like biphobic or homophobic harassment in the workplace. And these participants were either straight, gay, lesbian, or bisexual. So my advisor had asked participants to rate themselves as like one being mostly heterosexual, two being somewhat heterosexual, 3 was bisexual, 4 was mostly or somewhat homosexual, and 5 was mostly homosexual. So it was a weird rating system. I have no idea where he came up with it or found it. And so when we were analyzing the results, he had me first look at 1s and 2s as mostly heterosexual and 3s and 5s. 1s and 2s were heterosexual and 3s and 5s were homosexual, and then 3s were bisexual. But then when he didn't find the result he wanted, so basically he found that bisexual people were not experiencing significantly more harassment than any other group. At that point, he had me reconfigure basically who was listed as heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual by taking ones as now heterosexual, twos, threes, and fours as bisexual, and five as homosexual, which we know would not necessarily correspond to how those people were defining themselves or even ranking themselves in the first place. So from there, we created a totally misleading result that wasn't really respectful to our participants' identities that they told us that they were, and further was actually doing something that the school considered data falsification according to their data falsification guidelines. So it was basically selective reporting. So at that point, when I realized what we were doing after learning about that in the conference, I told my advisor, we have to either be transparent about it, say that it was just, sort of a post hoc thing that we did, or I can't do it. Like, I can't pretend that these people rated themselves as bisexual in the beginning when they clearly did not. That's probably not how they would define themselves. He got really angry about that, called me some really horrible names, like very publicly, wrote some unfortunately very inappropriate emails to other professors and people in the field that cost me jobs and other PhD positions if I wanted those. And basically sent me on a tailspin of just horrible experiences for a couple of years.
Yeah, I think one thing that came up a lot when I did grad chat about leaving PhDs and the concept of like what is academia outside of academia, a lot of people brought up the fact that your entire life and a lot of your career is kind of in the hands of your advisor. And a person that I interviewed put it really well that like all the risk in an advisor-advisee relationship is assumed by the advisee, and there's no risk to the advisor when all this stuff happens and they have so much control over your job and things like that. I want to go back a little bit first to kind of like this system of like figuring out whether a person is like where they are really sexually. Like I think as you realize, like, having just a scale of like a number scale is already kind of interestingly not quite right, because there's people who are pansexual, demisexual, ace, not even on like a scale. It's more of like I don't think you can really put it on like a numbers chart. How did you guys kind of like come up with this, and how did you like come to the realization that this might not be the best way to represent people with LGBTQ plus identities?
Sure. So to preface, I guess I did not create this experiment. So I did not design this experiment and I did not run this experiment. So all of the data were collected prior to me and being a PhD student. I was just working on the manuscript for authorship as my advisor's doctoral student. So my advisor is like a straight cis male. He, I guess, came up with this in his mind. I personally think that it's really hard to even give a Kinsey scale sometimes, because there are so many different ways that people define themselves now as people are learning about different sexual orientations and gender identities and things like that. I think it's better to actually just create a write-in if you can. Or another thing that maybe could have prevented this to begin with is if you specifically asked for participants who identified as bisexual, straight, heterosexual, or gay or lesbian, homosexual. So then you can avoid all that confusion down the line. You just ask for those participants up front. If that's how they define themselves, great. And then you can do whatever analysis you want.
Yeah, that certainly seems to be, I think, an easier way of if you want to ask a question involving the experience of bisexual people, for example, just get bisexual participants, right? What was it like to, like, I guess, stand up to your advisor? I think a lot of people feel that they can't even do that in situations like when you have requests to falsify data or you have an advisor who might not be very supportive. How do you kind of like overcome the like mental barrier of you need to stand up to this person who controls a significant amount of your life and your work and your future?
Yeah, I think that there was this misconception that I like marched into my advisor's office or like marched into a meeting and said, Andrew Stewart's making me falsify data and I'm not going to do it. And that's not how it was at all. We were just in like a one-on-one meeting. I brought up that I had learned about p hacking at SIPS at the conference. and that I thought what we did sort of fell under that umbrella. And so in response, he told me that I was intellectually underdeveloped. He repeated that phrase again in front of all of my peers and all of the social psychology faculty members, which is also, just to mention, extremely ableist and just not ever an appropriate thing to tell an advisee or a student or anyone. Yeah, so he told me that and basically said, if you don't like it, then that's like, you just don't get it. You're just too stupid to understand. So yeah, there wasn't a lot of like fortitude, I guess, in standing up to him. I just said, I learned about this thing. Are we doing this thing? Am I okay to do this? Am I going to get in trouble? And he told me, no, you're just stupid.
I imagine after that initial like realization of like him being like, okay, no, we're gonna do it my way. How did you decide to like kind of continue and like continue to push back and decide like, no, I don't think this is the right way to do it? How did you like not just kind of fold under the pressures of like, your job? And you mentioned you had sent all these emails and stuff. So this clearly must have been like kind of a longer time scale.
Yes, it was. It was, I think, over the course of like 6 or 7 months. So after he initially told me that sort of what I would consider an ableist slur, I was talking to a friend in another PhD program, and she said, well, I have a really great professor who's taking on doctoral students next year. You should apply here. So I actually decided to apply to 1 or 2 other programs. At that point, I was getting my master's degree in a few months, my en route master's. And I could have just probably transferred my PhD work over to another institution and started from there. So I'm trying to think of like how to go from one topic to another, but yeah, so I did all of that. And that's when I found out that he was sending emails. My advisor was sending emails to other faculty members to whom I'd applied, just telling them lies about me and writing actually such inappropriate things that one of the faculty members who received this email called him and said, that is so inappropriate to say about your female student. I would, like, you need to stop that immediately. I also totally forgot your question, so I'm so sorry about that.
No, you're all good. So it sounds like since it took place over so many months, like this really, I imagine, must have taken a toll on like your mental health and just kind of you being willing to even continue to apply to other places and constantly receiving news about these emails and things that he was saying. How did you kind of like decide to continue to retaliate and continue to like stay true and like this, I don't want to falsify my data and not just kind of like bend under the pressure? Like what mentally helped you?
I don't know. I just sort of pushed through with my own work. So I was doing my own en route master's thesis at that time. So I sort of focused all of my attention there. And as I was writing that other manuscript, I sort of pushed it to the side and said, we'll deal with that a little bit later because I've been working on all of these other things too. So I worked on my master's thesis and then basically like the day that I successfully received my master's degree, did my thesis and everything, my advisor just sent me a 1-line email saying, you're out of my lab.
Short, succinct, to the point. I guess that part's good, but dramatic. Did you have like any kind of like inclination that this was going to happen?
I had no idea. This was totally out of the blue because he, like I said, was pretty abusive, pretty cruel as far as advisors go. However, I've heard horror stories about advisors and about their relationships with advisees, so I didn't think anything was amiss. I clearly was able to successfully get my master's degree, so it's not like I was doing anything wrong academically. It's not like I had the equivalent of a 4.0 GPA and wasn't doing anything wrong, so I didn't think that there was any way where he could say that I was out of the program. But I guess these advisors have the power to do basically whatever they want.
Yeah, there's so many things that they can get away with and still not have any kind of like action taken against their job.
Mm-hmm.
this is kind of the next question we have is something that came up during a conversation of leaving grad school, but is there anything that can be done or that you did do in response to behavior that your advisor had, like in response to his abuse, his emails? Was there any institutional recourse, legal recourse? What are the consequences for this?
So obviously the consequences are non-existent because my advisor is still happily in his tenure track position, or he has tenure now. He was never disciplined in any way. He's still able to take on new students. It's not like he was particularly prolific or well known before, but it's not like his standing in the community has changed. And even the conference, so we presented this data at the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, which is the largest international conference for social psychologists. When they heard that this data or these results were falsified, they did nothing. And there's no no recourse, no consequence, no nothing. He's the same as he was before, and only I was hurt.
Gosh, I can imagine that's just incredibly frustrating and really awful. During, I guess, this whole experience, did you ever consider like pursuing legal action at any point? Was there even a possibility to involve like the institution or any legal like people in the problem?
There are. So, as part of this whole situation, I was made to go through sort of a sham review that no other student was asked to go through. So basically, I was asked to do like comps or like qual exams. So I was asked to do like an oral qual exam, and on the basis, like with no warning, I was just brought into a room and asked to do like quals. And on the basis of that, which no one else had to do, they said, well, you're not like at the stage that your peers are at. So that's extra impetus for you to be kicked from the program. And one of the review things that they used was more like stringent than a review that they used for an incoming male faculty member. So basically they were holding me to a higher standard than a male faculty member. So on the basis of that, I actually went to the Title IX office. They never investigated. I don't know if there's any recourse for that, but this is really at the heart of it a Title IX issue. It's Title IX retaliation. It's, I think, also Title 6 retaliation. Not an attorney, clearly, but
I think that one is like intentional discrimination. So possibly, yeah, I think, going back to your point, women are always held to a higher standard than men almost. It's really frustrating because it sounds like you really just took all these steps to try and position yourself to try and figure out what's going on and like try to find, you're talking to the people at your university, you're talking to people to figure out what can happen. And I think that's a big issue. Sometimes people kind of accuse you of like, oh, well, did you do this? Did you do that? And it's like, yeah, you actually did. It just didn't have any actual consequence.
right.
And in terms of consequence, it seems like a lot of it kind of landed on your shoulders. And on that note, can you go a little bit, if you're comfortable, into like the backlash and the retaliation that you received?
Yeah. So on the night, like I said, I had earned my master's degree, and then that night was just given a one-line email saying you're kicked out of the program. So I immediately called my best friend in the program, and I talked to my department head. She said, like, oh, sorry, we didn't realize that this was out of the blue. And it doesn't mean you're kicked out of the program. It just means you have to find a new, basically, dissertation advisor, as I was heading into my dissertation stage at that point. So luckily, my very best friend in the program was just hired as an incoming assistant professor in the psychology program. And he said, well, of course I'll take you onto my lab, into my lab. We're going to work together anyway. So it seemed like everything was fine up until basically the time when the faculty had to vote on whether or not I could stay in the program, even though I had found another advisor. And for reasons unbeknownst to me or really anyone. They said no, he could not take me into his lab. And from there, I was removed. So I forget again what the original question was, but that's sort of how I proceeded from there.
No, it's okay. That was exactly the question. Gosh, this just like, can you give us a sense of like time? Like at what point did you have to leave the PhD program because they decided you weren't allowed to join this other dissertation advisor?
So I earned my en route master's degree April 1st. And up until then, everything had been fine except for me not wanting to work on that one manuscript with my advisor. So I was told that night, you're out of the program. I think around May 20th, the faculty voted that I was not allowed to join this other lab. And by the way, there's no mention in the handbook of faculty voting about whether or not someone can stay in the program. I found another lab, and that was the lab I was supposed to be in. And so from there, I had to appeal, and I wasn't able to get, a final answer until I think close to Halloween. So this was all happening in 2019. So it was from April 1st to Halloween that I was there without a job, still paying rent in my apartment. I wasn't allowed to get another job outside of the university because, like most PhD contracts, are not supposed to work outside of your TA-ship or research assistantship. So if
Through all of this, you were still doing like your TA duties, your research assistant duties.
Yep, except for, so basically from April 1st to May 20th or whatever, I was doing that. But then from there on, I wasn't able to register for classes or do my TA-ship or anything that my contract allowed because I technically didn't have a lab because they wouldn't let me go into that other lab. But I also wasn't allowed to get a job elsewhere because then they can come back at me, or they could have come back at me and said, well, you're working elsewhere. That's also forbidden in your contract. So there's that. So basically I was sitting alone in my apartment from like May 20th to October, away from home, not in the same state as any of my family. My grad school friends obviously had to side with my advisor, otherwise they would have been retaliated against too. It was such a mess and so unnecessary. And like any faculty member at any time could have put an end to this, and they didn't.
Yeah, I imagine this just whole thing is just really isolating and awful, and just that lack of control over the whole situation is just really frustrating and like just disappointing. But I obviously can't speak to your experience. So what was this whole situation like on your mental health?
Yeah, I mean, to reflect what you just said, it was super isolating. My grad school friends, I think, wanted to support me but couldn't because they would be going up against their own advisors. And my advisor Andrew Stewart was the statistical consult for our program, so he was basically on everyone's paper. All the faculty members would come to him and have him be their co-author, so he would do their statistical analyses. So no one wanted to step on his feet. No one wanted to support me, so I was literally sitting alone, having my life ripped out from under me for 6-7 months, something like that. And it was horrible. Terrible for your mental health. Do not recommend it.
Yeah. Was there anything that like kind of helped you get through it? Were you, I don't know, leaning on friends outside of the program or going to therapy or, I don't know, baking sourdough bread?
That's another thing I want to mention, is that when you take away someone's salary and work and, basically meaning of their life, as PhD program is for a lot of people, you also take away their access to any mental health resources, to any community support, or to, even basic things like healthcare, which I was not eligible for because I wasn't a student. So I didn't have any of those things. I didn't have any community support because none of my friends were, able to talk to me without stepping on my advisor's toes. Didn't have any sort of mental health care, didn't have a car, lived right next to the university. So it was basically just the university around and nothing else. So yeah, it was definitely a lot of anguish, and really all I had was a guitar. So I started writing music, and like, I don't know, I did like Twitch for a while. I streamed on Twitch for some extra income.
Yeah, I think like the intersectionality of a lot of these resources is really wild. We always see things about like try this like 24 karat face mask and it'll make your skin really nice. And I'm like, is it really the face mask or is it just your access to a facial masseuse person who gives you a facial every single week or whatever, Miss Kendall Jenner? And like these like, the money and the health and the mental health, it all goes like hand in hand.
Yeah.
I saw from like some of our previous correspondence that you were also on the LGBTQ plus like mentorship program. You were the coordinator for like the grad students committee on their like sexual orientation and gender diversity committee. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and how it kind of like maybe reflected in your research?
Yeah, that was an awesome experience. So that was through the American Psychological Association grad students committee. It's called So Good. So it's the committee for sexual orientation and gender diversity. I think I missed a letter in there. But basically, we paired graduate students, I think they were mostly doctoral students in psychology, with practitioners, faculty members, and industry leaders coming from a psychology background who also identified as LGBT or LGBTQIA. So it was a way for people in psychology programs who are feeling isolated to connect with an actual professional in whatever industry they wanted to go into, and not only network, but get some community support. So we had, I think, about 50 mentor pairs in the 2019 to 2020 school year, which was awesome.
Wow, that sounds like a really useful resource for anyone who is in psychology and is part of the LGBTQ plus community. I think having communities like that outside of your university can be really helpful because then they kind of like, they understand the world of academia, but they're not entwined with every rumor and things like that that are going on in your university necessarily. Do you have any advice for advisors who want to properly support their LGBTQ plus students?
Yeah, I would say definitely be aware of the resources that are available at your university and in your broader field. So maybe look into, if you're a psychology professor, maybe look into what the APA has to offer for LGBTQ students. And if you know that you can't provide that mentorship for yourself or for your student by yourself, connect them with other people. And I would also, I always say this, but just like be a decent human being to your mentees. There's never a reason to call someone any sort of slur or to say anything particularly negative to them. And I think that that can go a long way in supporting mental health for not only people of marginalized communities, but just anyone in general.
Yeah, certainly. Do you have a sense of like what kind of resources typically exist at universities for advisors to take advantage of?
Sometimes universities will have LGBTQ centers that are designated. Other times there might be like LGBTQ research happening, and those faculty members will sometimes be a part of the community themselves. So I'd recommend those things. You can always have the university's mental health resources on hand. And I think that's about it. I mean, you can also be aware of like local happenings and things like that that you can connect
Yeah,
to.
I think a lot of it just comes down to if you care about something, you can take the effort to just Google LGBTQ plus resources and then your city name or your university and just putting in that little bit of effort.
Exactly.
Um, yeah. So now you've changed fields, right? You're now doing an MBA.
I am doing an MBA. So I'm doing an MBA at the University of Memphis, which has been nothing but lovely thus far. Um, it's definitely a pivot, and it's a different type of, or it's a different way of looking at research and of looking at data. But it's really been a great integration with my psychology background. And I have nothing but good things to say about that so far.
Yeah. Did your experience in academia like put you off doing psychology and research, or is it a little more like everything that happened has made it impossible?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that there's no way to continue with my psychology PhD now, just because I'm so known, I guess, as the person attached to this unfortunate situation. But it also made me realize that a lot of psychology research is predicated on these misleading or erroneous findings, which really turned me off of the field in general. I think we need to really integrate more transparent practices into our science.
Yeah, certainly. As a science communicator, I fully agree. I think there's a lot of like public just hesitancy and things like that around science, especially because you can mess with your p-value and you can do these little statistical things. And there's a book I highly recommend for anyone who is interested in like all these different forms. It's called Innumeracy, and it goes into like all these different ways of displaying data or analyzing data that can hugely affect the outcomes. And it has a lot of like examples in which that actually came true. Um, so kind of pivoting a little bit off of that, you mentioned that you like got into like Twitch streaming and playing your guitar a little more. Can you tell us a little bit about like any music you're working on now?
Sure. I'm working with producer Riley Gear, who was, I think, formerly a member of Unknown Mortal Orchestra and now plays for Caroline Rose. Oh, do you know that?
I saw Unknown Mortal Orchestra like a couple years ago in what
Oh,
was it, like Belgium. Gosh, this is such a weird coincidence.
so dope. Yeah, he was their drummer for a while. And I don't know how we met, but we were friendly and I don't know, we were like talking about my situation back when this was happening in 2019. Um, and he like encouraged me to get, to have him produce this song that I was writing as I was just like sitting solemnly in my little apartment. So I have a song coming out on June 18th. I just said that really weird, but that's fine.
Yeah,
So
so what is it, just 2 weeks from now? This is very exciting. I'm gonna keep an eye out for it when it does come out. Can you tell us anything about the song, like the title or anything? Do we get a little sneak peek?
yeah, it's called Winston. It's not about this situation in particular. It was just I was looking to write about like other experiences, and I needed something to do as I was sitting there. So it's kind of like a psychedelic rock song, very I would say very much in the style of Unknown Mortal Orchestra. And Riley played drums. My friend Jacob Adam Davis from Memphis. Well, he was in Memphis, now he's not. But he played lead guitar. Erica Schaefer, who's another fantastic musician, is playing bass. And it'll be out. It's on my social media somewhere. I'm really
Excellent.
bad at advertising stuff.
It's an ever growing thing to do, I think, especially with like social media and stuff being as it is. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We'll keep an eye out for your EP coming out, and thank you so much for talking about this. I know it was a really difficult situation, but I hope that now you've left, you've hopefully been able to find a community in your MBA and here at PhD Balance too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.